This is AM Agenda.
Now to our panel this morning, Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer, Steve Ciobo, joins me, as well as Labor MP Kelvin Thomson. Good morning to you both, Steve Ciobo. Now, Tony Abbott wants this beyond just the asylum seeker issue or transactional issues as they've been described in the past.
Sure.
But to get there, will he have to make some compromise on this other thorny issue, which remains a concern to the Indonesians?
Well, look, we welcome this visit. It's the first visit by Australia's new Prime Minister, the first overseas visit to one of our most important trading partners and, of course, a very near and important strategic partner in terms of this part of the world. And this visit really, in many respects, Kieran, although there's a lot of media focus on what's happening with asylum seekers, the reality is that this visit is about broadening and deepening the relationship between Australia and Indonesia. And I've got absolutely no doubt that we'll see very positive outcomes from this, because Australia is under new management. We're open for business. We're indicating that very forcefully and strongly today with the Indonesians to show that we want to engage on a whole range of different fronts. And I believe the asylum seeker will, as the Prime Minister has already outlined, only be but one small part of it. And what's more, I've no doubt with our policies, in time, it will be an ever decreasing part of the relationship.
Do you think he'll have to compromise, soften the rhetoric a bit when he's sitting there with President Yudhoyono later today in Jakarta to get them across the line? Because clearly from the Indonesian Foreign Minister in the last week and in the weeks preceding, he's pretty clear on the fact that they don't like significant components of your border protection policy.
Well, look, we understand there are domestic political considerations in Indonesia that are playing out through some of this. We understand, of course, and appreciate where Indonesia's coming from. By the same token, I know that Indonesia understands some of Australia's concerns, the fact that we repeatedly see Indonesian flagged vessels impinging on Australia's sovereignty. And the reality is that there is a will, and no doubt goodwill on both sides, that will see this relegated to being a fairly small part of the relationship, and when recognised against the aggregate, which is of course the whole relationship between our two nations, I really don't think that this is going to be that big a problem.
Kelvin Thomson, the point that Steve Ciobo made there about Indonesian flagged boats and Indonesian crewed boats impinging on Australian sovereignty is a similar point to what we saw from Alexander Downer over recent days. He'll be joining me, incidentally, at 9 o'clock this morning, the former Foreign Minister, to discuss this visit. But Mr Downer makes the same point, that they're Indonesian flagged vessels, crewed vessels. Why can't Australia simply turn them back to where they came from?
Kieran, this morning in Melbourne there's a big wind, but in Jakarta there's a whirlwind as the Liberal government reaps what it has sown in relation to boat people. During the Howard years they abandoned bipartisan policy concerning asylum seekers for political advantage, and in continuing to seek political advantage on this issue they have come up with policies which are highly offensive to the Indonesian government and brought about a situation where what should be only a minor irritant in the relationship has rapidly become a festering sore. Yeah, but
the fact is, Kelvin Thomson, as Alexander Downer put it, that other countries around Indonesia do turn boats back when they arrive, or you know, that's their policy, like Singapore, which would not accept a boat of asylum seekers from Indonesia if it's an Indonesian flagged boat. So why can't Australia adopt the same approach? That's the bottom line here, isn't it?
The bottom line is that we should have a regional solution, a regional outcome which involves cooperation with Indonesia, with Malaysia, with others of our regional partners in order to seek political advantage in opposition. The opposition was prepared to let the genie out of the bottle concerning this issue. As the events of the past week have shown, it is very difficult for them to get the genie back in the bottle. What we need is a regional approach involving cooperation with neighbouring countries. That is what the previous government worked on throughout its period in office, and that continues to be the way forward.
You just don't live in the real world.
Break. Steve, just quickly, very quickly, I've got to go to a break.
I mean, Labor doesn't live in the real world on this. I mean, they're still talking about policies that failed, that brought 50,000 people here, and saying, oh, the solution is still just over the hill. I mean, you know, this tired rhetoric from Labor, it needs to be abandoned. They need to come up with a fresh approach.
You've engaged in breathtaking hypocrisy in relation to this.
Let's take a break. We'll be right back this morning on AM Agenda. Stay with us. This is AM Agenda. Thanks for your company this Monday morning. And with me, Labor MP Kelvin Thomson and Liberal Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer, Steve Ciobo. Steve Ciobo, I want to ask you about this travel expenses issue. Senator Brandis, the Attorney General, paid back $1,700 yesterday, which had been claimed for flights, accommodation and rental cars. He says it was within the rules. While it might be within the letter of the law, is it within the spirit, Steve Ciobo?
Well, look, I mean, the former Prime Minister Julia Gillard flew to Byron Bay to attend the wedding of her press secretary, and she did so on the government VIP jet. And the new member for Rankin, Jim Chalmers, the two of them got married. So, you know, I scratch my head about Labor Party people that go out too strongly on this, especially when I see one of the lead characters is Tony Burke. This is a man who's repaid thousands of dollars back to the Australian government for incorrectly claimed entitlements. So, you know, I think what's important here and what needs to happen to give taxpayers certainty, Kieran, is for there to be greater clarity around this. Now, the entitlement is that you can make a claim if it's for official business. Now, whether official business includes private events or not is obviously what part of the conversation's about. Now, I understand Labor's desperate to get a headline, and so Labor's out there with this holier-than-thou approach. But as I said, you had a former Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, fly to a wedding on the government-funded VIP aircraft. It's the new member for Rankin's wedding, Jim Chalmers, and then you've also got Tony Burke out there prosecuting the case, who's repaid thousands of dollars. So I think what we need is more clarity rather than political point scoring from Labor, frankly.
Kelvin Thomson, the individuals that Steve referred to there aren't the only ones who've repaid expenses. This is something which has been a common occurrence on both sides over recent years.
Well, I'm not familiar with the particular cases that Steve just outlined, and obviously you can have a situation where people do a number of things when they are travelling from one part of the country to the other. But if the only thing that you're doing is to attend a wedding, that does seem to me to be problematic. I've never met a bride and groom who've invited guests to their wedding on the basis that they wanted to discuss work with them. If you're going to someone's wedding, it's because you're their friend, and in my view you should pay for it yourself. I think that George Brandis has damaged his credibility in relation to this, and really that the government should be looking for someone else now to deal with ministerial code of conduct matters.
But if this is something which others have done, like, you know, the example cited by Steve Ciobo, is it not double standards from Labor to demand that of the Attorney General?
Well, I made the point, Kieran, that the issue in many cases will be what was the full nature of the trip, what other business is being transacted. As I said, on the face of it, it seems to me that if you're going to a wedding, you're going there because you're someone's friend, essentially a private transaction, which you should be paying for yourself.
All right, what do you think of that, Steve Ciobo, as a principle? As I get back to that first point, while it might be within the letter of the law, is it in the spirit? And do front benchers need to be a bit more cautious on this spend?
Look, I think that everybody needs to be cautious when it comes to the use of taxpayers' money. The reality is this is taxpayers' money that we're talking about, and so everybody needs to exercise good judgment. The reality is that I don't think there's effectively anybody in Parliament that comes to this with perfectly clean hands. And what I mean by that, Kieran, is that the reality is that the rules around entitlements with respect to travel and all those are so grey and so convoluted. There are so many different interpretations around the actual act itself that's applied by bureaucrats within the Department of Finance, that it often becomes very difficult. And that's why there are literally tens and tens of members of Parliament that have had to repay because they thought they were doing the right thing, but then it was subsequently judged that no, that wasn't, and so they would repay the money. Labor's done it, Liberals done it, Greens have done it, Nationals have done it, Independents have done it, and it's not about there being sort of poor morals among us. It's actually just about the rules being so convoluted, it's often hard to know whether you're within or outside of them.
Yeah, let's move on. I want to talk about the paid parental leave scheme that Tony Abbott's going to seek to legislate.
Sure,
apparently before July next year. Why the rush in terms of legislating this when it's not going to start for another year?
Look, there's no rush here, Kieran. This is about us being a government with a number of key priorities, and we just want to get stuck into the business of repairing the damage that Labor left behind. So when it comes to the PPL, look, this was a pretty big issue throughout the campaign. It was discussed almost daily. The reality is that we are ready and roaring to go. So we're going to be putting in place legislation that adopts our framework. We want to put that through the Parliament. We want to have it ready because we are ready to govern. What we don't want are political games when we have a clear mandate to go ahead and do this to bring us in line with the rest of the world.
Will Tony Abbott be willing to negotiate with the Greens? They support the idea in principle but want the cap on money paid to new mothers at $100,000 per annum, not $150,000. Would your leader be willing to negotiate on those elements, do you think?
I think the answer to your question really depends upon what the Labor Party does. The reality is that if Labor buries its head on the sand, if Labor tries to engage in political point scoring, if Labor is satisfied to see Australian women continue to only be paid at minimum wage and to have no super, as opposed to the Coalition which wants to provide Australian women with a replacement wage and with superannuation, well then we might have to look at the Greens. But ultimately it comes back to whether Labor is in touch with what the broad majority of Australians want, and only time will tell.
Kelvin, Thomson, I guess this comes back to the broader argument about does Tony Abbott have a mandate for all of his policy agenda or not? And as Steve Ciobo pointed out, this has been something he has said is a signature policy of his. So it's hardly a peripheral issue or policy.
As I pointed out previously, Kieran, we all get elected to the Parliament on the basis of the undertakings that we make to our own electorates and the policies we put to our own electorates. And I made very clear prior to the election that I was opposed to the 6 months paid parental leave scheme, that I thought it was extravagant. I think it's quite remarkable that the government proposes to increase company tax to pay for it. If it was a Labor government proposing to increase company tax...
Actually, we're cutting company tax, Kelvin. We're cutting company tax.
Steve Ciobo and others would be out there straight away saying how outrageous this was and how ordinary Australians would be made to pay for it through supermarkets increasing their prices, the impact on self-funded retirees who aren't able to engage in frank credits, the impact on ordinary Australians of this policy change. You would be the first people out there condemning such a policy. It's remarkable that on the one hand you tell us that we're experiencing a budget emergency and we've got to put an end to the age of entitlement and the culture of entitlement. On the other hand, you come up with such an extravagant policy as this one.
There are some reports around, Steve Ciobo, that the government will consider looking at further privatisations of remaining government business enterprises, Australia Post, Air Services Australia, Medibank Private among them. What's your view on this? Do you think it's likely?
Well, the only privatisation that we took to the election was the privatisation of Medibank Private. There's no other plans to do any further privatisation beyond that. And the reality is, Kieran, that, look, Australia does face some serious economic challenges. And I just heard Kelvin's rant there, filled with misinformation, including, the absurd statement that under the Coalition there'll be no more franking credits. I mean, that is completely wrong. But the challenge that we've got is this. Labor left office, Labor inherited office with a $20 billion surplus and left office with a $30 billion deficit. Labor inherited $50 billion in net savings and left office with net debt approaching $200 billion. So we've got some serious financial challenges to start to repair all that damage, to start to pay down Labor's debt, but we're not going to do it necessarily through the sale of assets.
Kelvin, Thomson, less than a minute to go, but your thoughts on the prospect of the Commission of Audit recommending a further consolidation of government business enterprises like those that I mentioned a bit earlier, Australia Post among them?
Tony Abbott said under his government there would be no surprises, and Malcolm Turnbull wrote to the Communication Workers Union saying that Australia Post would not be privatised. So the expectation of Australians right across the nation is that there will not be privatisations and there will not be asset sales.
Kelvin, Thomson, Steve Ciobo, gents, have a good week. Thanks.
Thanks, Kieran.
Thank you.
Thanks.
A quick break on AM Agenda. When we return, the former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer.